The Ideal of Human Unity. Chapter 33, Internationalism and Human Unity. The great necessity, then, and the great difficulty, is to help this idea of humanity, which is already at work upon our minds, and has even begun in a very slight degree to influence from above our actions, and turn it into something more than an idea, however strong, to make it a central motive and a fixed part of our nature. Its satisfaction must become a necessity of our psychological being, just as the family idea or the national idea has become each a psychological motive with its own need of satisfaction. But how is this to be done? The family idea had the advantage of growing out of a primary vital need in our being, and therefore it had not the least difficulty in becoming a psychological motive and need, for our readiest and strongest mental motives and psychological needs are those which grow out of our vital necessities and instincts. The clan and the tribe ideas had a similar origin, less primary and compelling, and therefore looser and more dissoluble. But still they arose from the vital necessity in human nature for aggregation, and the ready basis given to it by the inevitable physical growth of the family into clan or tribe. These were natural aggregations, evolutionary forms already prepared on the animal level. The nation idea, on the contrary, did not arise from a primary vital need, but from a secondary or even tertiary necessity, which resulted not from anything inherent in our vital nature, but from circumstances, from environmental evolution. It arose not from a vital, but from a geographical and historical necessity. And we notice that, as one result, it had to be created most commonly by force of circumstances partly, no doubt, but also by physical force, by the power of the king and the conquering tribe, converted into a military and dominant state. Or else it came by a reaction against force, a revolt against conquest and domination, that brought a slow or sudden compactness to peoples who, though geographically or even historically and culturally one, had lacked power of cohesion and remained too conscious of an original heterogeneity or of local and regional and other divisions. But still the necessity was there, and the nation form, after many failures and false successes, got into being, and the psychological motive of patriotism, a sign of the growth of a conscious national ego, arose in the form as the expression of its soul and the guarantee of its durability. For without such a soul, such a psychological force and presence within the frame, there can be no guarantee of durability. Without it, what circumstances have created, circumstances easily will destroy. It was for this reason that the ancient world failed to create nations, except on a small scale. Little clans and small regional nations of brief duration and usually of loose structure. It created only artificial empires, which went to pieces and left chaos behind them. What then of this international unity, now in the first obscure throes of the preformatory state, resembling a ferment of cells drawing together for amalgamation? What is the compelling necessity behind it? If we look at outward things only, the necessity is much less direct and much less compelling than any that preceded it. There is here no vital necessity. Mankind as a whole can get on well enough without international unity, so far as mere living goes. It will not be at all a perfect, rational, or ideal collective living of the race. But after all, where is there yet any element in human life or society which is perfect, rational, or ideal? As yet, at least none. Still, we get on somehow with life, because the vital man in us, who is the dominant element in our instincts and in our actions, cares for none of these things, and is quite satisfied with any just tolerable or any precariously or partly agreeable form of living, because that is all to which he is accustomed, and all, therefore, that he feels to be necessary. The men who are not satisfied, the thinkers, the idealists, are always a minority, and in the end, an ineffectual minority. Because though always in the end they do get their way partly, their victory yet turns into a defeat. For the vital man remains still the majority, and degrades the apparent success into a pitiful parody of their rational hope, their clear-sighted ideal, or their strong counsel of perfection. The geographical necessity for a unification of this kind does not exist, unless we consider that it has been created through the drawing closer together of the earth and its inhabitants, by science and her magical lessening of physical distances and attenuation of barriers. But whatever may happen in the future, this is as yet not sufficient. Earth is still large enough, and her divisions still real enough for her to do without any formal unity. If there is any strong need, it may be described, if such an epithet can be applied to a thing in the present and the future, as a historical necessity, that is, a need which has arisen as the result of certain actual circumstances that have grown up in the evolution of international relations. And that need is economic, political, mechanical, likely under certain circumstances to create some tentative or preliminary framework, but not at first a psychological reality which will vivify the frame. Moreover, it is not yet sufficiently vital to be precisely a necessity, for it amounts mainly to a need for the removal of certain perils and inconveniences, such as the constant danger of war, and at most to the strong desirability of a better international coordination. But by itself, this creates only a possibility, not even a moral certainty, of a first vague sketch and loose framework of unity, which may or may not lead to something more close and real. But there is another power than that of external circumstance. which we have a right to take into consideration. For behind all the external circumstances and necessities of which we are more easily aware in nature, there is always an internal necessity in the being, a will and a design in nature itself, which precedes the outward signals of its development, and in spite of all obstacles and failures, must, in the long end, inevitably get itself realized. Nowadays, we can see this truth everywhere in nature, down to her lowest forms, a will in the very seed of the being, not quite conscious, or only partially conscious in the form itself, but still present there in nature. It is subconscious, or even inconscient, if you like. But it is still a blind will, a mute idea which contains beforehand the form it is going to create, is aware of a necessity other than the environmental, a necessity contained in the very being itself, and creates persistently and inevitably a form that best answers to the necessity, however we may labor to interfere with or thwart its operations. This is true biologically, but it is also, though in a more subtle and variable way, psychologically true. Now, the very nature of man is that of an individual who, on one side, is always emphasizing and developing his individual being to the extent of his power, but who is also driven by the idea or truth within him to unify himself with others of his species, to join himself to them or agglutinate them to him, to create human groups, aggregates, and collectivities. And if there is an aggregate or collectivity which is possible for him to realize, but is not yet realized, we may be sure that that too, in the end, he will create. This will in him is not always or often quite conscient or foreseeing. It is often largely subconscient, but even then, it is eventually irresistible. And if it gets into his conscious mind, as the international idea has now done, we may count on a more rapid evolution. Such a will in nature creates for itself favorable external circumstances and happenings, or finds them created for it in the stress of events. And even if they are insufficient, she will still often use them beyond their apparent power of effectivity, not minding the possibility of failure, for she knows that in the end she will succeed, and every experience of failure will help to better the eventual success. Well then, it may be said, let us trust to this inevitable will in nature, and let us follow out her method of operation. Let us create anyhow this framework, any framework of the aggregate, for she knows already the complete form she intends, and she will work it out eventually in her own time, by the power of the idea and our will to realize it, by help of strong force of circumstances, by pressure of all kinds, by physical force even, if need be, since that too seems still to be a part of her necessary machinery. Let us create it. Let us have the body. The soul will grow in the body. And we need not mind if the bodily formation is artificial, with at first a small or no conscious psychological reality to vivify it. That will begin to form itself as soon as the body has been formed. For the nation, too, was at first more or less artificially formed, out of incoherent elements actually brought together by the necessity of a subconscient idea, though apparently it was done only by physical force and the force of circumstances. As a national ego formed, which identified itself with the geographical body of the nation and developed in it the psychological instinct of national unity and the need of its satisfaction, so a collective human ego will develop in the international body and will evolve in it the psychological instinct of human unity and the need of its satisfaction. That will be the guarantee of duration. And that possibility is how the thing will happen, man being what he is. Indeed, if we cannot do better, it will so happen, since happen somehow it must, whether in the worse way or the better. It may be as well to review here briefly, in the light of these considerations, the main possibilities and powers which are shaping us towards such an end in the present world conditions. The old means of unification, conquest by a single great power, which would reduce part of the world by force, and bring the remaining nations into the condition of dependencies, protectorates, and dependent allies, the whole forming the basic structure of a great final unification. This was the character of the ancient Roman precedent. Does not seem immediately possible. It would require a great predominance of force simultaneously by sea and land. Footnote, now also by air, and an irresistibly superior science and organization, and with all this a constantly successful diplomacy and an invincible good fortune. If war and diplomacy are still to be the decisive factors in international politics, in the future as in the past, it would be rash to predict that such a combination may not arise, and if other means fail, it must arise. For there is nothing that can be set down as impossible in the chances of the future, and the urge in nature always creates its own means. But at present, the possibilities of the future do not seem to point in this direction. There is, on the other hand, a very strong possibility of the whole earth, or at least the 3 continents of the Eastern Hemisphere, being dominated by 3 or 4 great empires, largely increased in extent of dominion, spheres of influence, protectorates, and thereby exercising a preeminence which they could either maintain by agreements, avoiding all causes of conflict, or in a rivalry which would be the cause of fresh wars and changes. This would normally have been the result of the great European conflict. But there has struck across this possibility a revived strength of the idea of nationality, expressed in the novel formula of the principle of self-determination, to which the great world empires have had to pay at least a verbal homage. The idea of international unity, to which this intervention of the revived force of nationality is leading takes the form of a so-called League of Nations. Practically, however, the League of Nations, under present conditions, or any likely to be immediately realized, would still mean the control of the earth by a few great powers, a control that would be checked only by the necessity of conciliating the sympathy and support of the more numerous smaller or less powerful nations. On the force and influence of these few would rest practically, if not admittedly, the decision of all important, debatable questions. And without it, there could be no chance of enforcing the decisions of the majority against any recalcitrant great power or combination of powers. The growth of democratic institutions would perhaps help to minimize the chances of conflict and the abuses of power, though that is not at all certain. But it would not alter this real character of the combination. In all this, there is no immediate prospect of any such form of unification as would give room for a real psychological sense of unity, much less necessitate its growth. Such a form might evolve, but we should have to trust for it to the chapter of accidents, or at best to the already declared urge in nature, expressed in the internationalist idea. On that side, there was at one time a possibility which seemed to be very suddenly and rapidly growing into something more: the emergence of a powerful party in all the advanced countries of the world, pledged to internationalism, conscious of its necessity as a first condition for their other aims, and more determined to give it precedence and to unite internationally to bring it about. That combination of the intellectuals with labor, which created the socialist parties in Germany, Russia, and Austria, formed anew recently the Labour Party in England, and has had its counterparts in most other European countries, seems to be traveling in that direction. This worldwide movement, which made internationalism and labor rule its two main principles, had already created the Russian Revolution and seemed ready to bring about another great socialistic revolution in Central Europe. It was conceivable that this party might everywhere draw together. By a chain of revolutions such as took place in the 19th century, and of less violent but still rapid evolutions, brought about by the pressure of their example, or even by simply growing into the majority in each country, the party might control Europe. It might create counterparts of itself in all the American republics and in Asiatic countries. It might, by using the machinery of the League of Nations, or, where necessary, by physical force, or economic, or other pressure, persuade or compel all the nations into some more stringent system of international unification. A world state, or else a close confederation of democratic peoples, might be created with a common governing body for the decision of principles and for all generally important affairs, or at least for all properly international affairs and problems. A common law of the nations might grow up, and international courts to administer it, and some kind of system of international police control to maintain and enforce it. In this way, by the general victory of an idea, socialist or other, seeking to organize humanity according to its own model, or by any other yet unforeseen way, a sufficient formal unity might come into existence. The question then arises, how, out of this purely formal unity, a real psychological unity can be created, and whether it can be made a living oneness. For a mere formal, mechanical, administrative, political, and economic union does not necessarily create a psychological unity. None of the great empires have yet succeeded in doing that, and even in the Roman, where some sense of unity did come into being, it was nothing very close and living. It could not withstand all shocks from within and without. It could not prevent what was much more dangerous, the peril of decay and devitalization, which the diminution of the natural elements of free variation and helpful struggle brought with it. A complete world union would have indeed this advantage, that it would have no need to fear forces from without, for no such forces would any longer exist. But this very absence of outer pressure might well give greater room and power to internal elements of disintegration, and still more to the opportunities of decay. It might, indeed, for a long time foster an internal, intellectual, and political activity and social progress, which would keep it living. But this principle of progress would not be always secure against the natural tendency to exhaustion and stagnation, which every diminution of variety, and even the very satisfaction of social and economic well-being, might well hasten. Disruption of unity would then be necessary to restore humanity to life. Again, while the Roman Empire appealed only to the idea of Roman unity, an artificial and accidental principle, this world state would appeal to the idea of human unity, a real and vital principle. But if the idea of unity can appeal to the human mind, so too can the idea of separative life, for both address themselves to vital instincts of his nature. What guarantee will there be that the latter will not prevail when man has once tried unity and finds, perhaps, that its advantages do not satisfy his whole nature? Only the growth of some very powerful psychological factor will make unity necessary to him. Whatever other changes and manipulations might be desirable to satisfy his other needs and instincts. The formal unification of mankind would come in upon us in the shape of a system which would be born, grow, come to its culmination. But every system, by the very nature of things, tends after its culmination to decay and die. To prevent the organism from decaying and dying, there must be such a psychological reality within as will persist and survive all changes of its body. Nations have that in a sort of collective national ego, which persists through all vital changes. But this ego is not by any means self-existent and immortal. It supports itself on certain things with which it is identified. First, there is the geographical body, the country. Secondly, the common interests of all who inhabit the same country: defense, economic well-being and progress, political liberty, etc. Thirdly, a common name, sentiment, culture. But we have to mark that this national ego owes its life to the coalescence of the separative instinct and the instinct of unity. For the nation feels itself one as distinguished from other nations. It owes its vitality to interchange with them and struggle with them all the activities of its nature. Nor are all these altogether sufficient. There is a deeper factor. There must be a sort of religion of country, a constant, even if not always explicit, recognition, not only of the sacredness of the physical mother, the land, but also, in however obscure a way, of the nation as a collective soul, which it is the first duty and need of every man to keep alive, to defend from suppression or mortal attaint, or, if suppressed, then to watch, wait, and struggle for its release and rehabilitation. If sicklied over with the touch of any fatal spiritual ailment, then to labor always, to heal and revivify and save alive. The world state will give its inhabitants the great advantages of peace, economic well-being, general security, combination for intellectual, cultural, social activity, and progress. None of these are in themselves sufficient to create the thing needed. Peace and security we all desire at present, because we have them not in sufficiency. But we must remember that man has also within him the need of combat, adventure, struggle, almost requires these for his growth and healthy living. That instinct would be largely suppressed by a universal peace and a flat security, and it might rise up successfully against suppression. Economic well-being by itself cannot permanently satisfy, and the price paid for it might be so heavy as to diminish its appeal and value. The human instinct for liberty, individual and national, might well be a constant menace to the world state, unless it so skillfully arranged its system as to give them sufficient free play. A common intellectual and cultural activity and progress may do much, but need not by themselves be sufficient to bring into being the fully powerful psychological factor that would be required. And the collective ego created would have to rely on the instinct of unity alone, for it would be in conflict with the separative instinct which gives the national ego half its vitality. It is not impossible that the indispensable inner factor for this outer frame might be increasingly created in its very process of growth. But certain psychological elements would have to be present in great strength. There would be needed, to make the change persist, a religion of humanity, or an equivalent sentiment much more powerful, explicit, self-conscious, universal in its appeal than the nationalists' religion of country. The clear recognition by man, in all his thought and life, of a single soul in humanity, of which each man and each people is an incarnation and soul form, an ascension of man beyond the principle of ego, which lives by separativeness, and yet there must be no destruction of individuality, for without that man would stagnate. A principle and arrangement of the common life, which would give free play to individual variation, interchange in diversity, and the need of adventure and conquest, by which the soul of man lives and grows great, and sufficient means of expressing all the resultant complex life and growth in a flexible and progressive form of human society.